now that we've sussed out the sons of God and we've discussed what is going on with the angels, with the teachings, and with the full sin, it might be helpful to now to turn to the offspring of these unions, because that's almost equally the cause of the spread of evil and violence over the earth. So we read that these figures are called Nephilim, and they're also called Gibborim, which is just Hebrew for mighty warriors or mighty men. They are from ancient times, men of renown. You could translate that men of the name as well. But the two Hebrew words here are Nephilim and Gibborim. Now, I don't have time to go into the etymology of especially Nephilim. Gibborim is pretty clear. It's used elsewhere in the Bible to talk about giant warriors. Excuse me. It's used to talk about David's warriors, Solomon's warriors, Pharaoh's warriors. It's clearly talking about like warriors and violent men. Nephilim, however, is quite rare, especially in this form. Every other time it's used is in Joshua and Deuteronomy and Numbers, where it's expected that you know what it means, because just like here in Genesis 6, it's not explained. So there's some interest that possibly Nephilim comes from the Hebrew root naphal, which means fall or fallen. And that leads some to interpret the Nephilim as being the sons of God. So the Nephilim are fallen ones. That's definitely the case in some Second Temple literature. Even some of early Jewish literature has that interpretation. But other interpretations say that the Nephal or Nephilim, one doesn't really quite agree with the vowel pattern of the Hebrew root naphal. It's different vowels. And also, it might be more connected with the Aramaic term, Nephilim, which means actually giants there. And so when you look at that, plus you look at the fact that in the LXX translations of Genesis 6, the Greek translations all use the Greek word gigantes, which is giant, that it might be more universally accepted that this word means giants or refers to giant beings. So that's just a quick overview of what that word means. I won't get into that in this. I'm just going to assume that it means giants, but I'll explain why based off a textual perspective more than a etymological perspective. That might just be helpful though. Josephus, when he talks about this, he says that the unions of the angels and the women begot sons that were despisers of all that is good. The tradition is that these men did what resembled the acts of those whom the Grecians call giants. So what Josephus is meaning there is that the Nephilim in Genesis 6 are best understood as the same entities in Greek mythology, the gigantes, or the giants. And that's, of course, we see that in the Greek translation of Genesis 6 as well. Definitely talking about giants here. We also see in the Sibylline Oracles, which again I mentioned earlier, this is an early Christian piece of literature, talks about them being a mighty race of men, mighty and of great form, mighty spirit. They were terrible men. They performed evil things. War, slaughter, and battles destroyed them. They were men of proud heart, which is very similar wording to the wording in Genesis 6, men of renown, men of the name. And it also says that they shed much blood, did not fear God or men, and a raging wrath of grievous unholiness afflicted them from within. So they're like big, mighty men, and they're violent, effectively, is what these texts tell us. But where do we get this understanding in the biblical literatures? That's probably a better base start. So we're clear that later literature interpreted them as giants and warriors. Where does that come from, though? So we see that one other figure in these stories is called a Gibborim, and that figure is Nimrod in Genesis 10. I won't discuss Nimrod at length here, but I want to just focus on how he's described as a Gibbor or a Gibborim. We'll leave Nimrod in Genesis 10 for the last session to really discuss him. But what's interesting is that this figure Nimrod is connected with Babel, Erech, Akkad, Kalna, and Shinar, which are all connected with Assyria, Nineveh, and obviously Babylon. This figure is a culture hero. He's sort of the founder of these nations and these cities. And what's really interesting is a lot of biblical scholarship has been gone into how do we identify Nimrod? Who is Nimrod? How does he fit in with the not only the biblical story, but also the surrounding cultures. Might we find connections with, if he's connected with Babylon in the Bible, could we find parallels in the Babylonian literature? And funny enough, you can find that in the Babylonian literature with the figure of Gilgamesh. In his description, Nimrod is really, really similar to Gilgamesh. Just as Nimrod has many cities named after him, these same cities are listed in Babylonian literature as being ruled by Gilgamesh. Just like Nimrod, Gilgamesh is a mighty warrior and a mighty hunter, identical to the description of Nimrod in Genesis 10. He's also described as being 2/3 divine and 1 mortal, and being 16 feet tall. In other words, he is the offspring of a spiritual being and a woman, and he's a giant, which should ring many bells from how we've been understanding the sons of God and the Nephilim in the Genesis 6 passages. So because of these parallels, many scholars have said that Gilgamesh 1 is portrayed as a giant, the same way that Nimrod then is portrayed as a giant. He's a Gibborim and a Nephilim. And interestingly, this is just another little point, that Gilgamesh is actually one of the names of the giants in the literature of the Dead Sea Scrolls, called the Book of the Giants, which talks about the giants and their activities before the flood. And so you can see in that picture there, that's a ancient Assyrian relief of Gilgamesh from the 8th century. And you can see how big he is compared to the lion he's holding. So he's definitely a giant in this. So from that, we can see in the biblical literature that this figure of Nimrod is really quite similar to later depictions of these Gibborim and Nephilim giant figures. What's more is that the name Nimrod itself is connected with rebellion, especially spiritual rebellion. The name Nimrod is actually interpreted as being from the root marad, which means to rebel in Hebrew. And so when you add the ni at the start, which is a common plural prefix, it means, his name Nimrod means we shall rebel. So it refers to a group of entities, probably Nimrod being one of the chief entities, who are in rebellion. And we, again, we'll discuss this rebellion more when we look at Genesis 10 and 11 and the Tower of Babel and that. But it's helpful here to note how these connections go back to these Gibborim figures in Genesis 6, and how the Bible and then obviously later literature expounds upon these figures. With that in mind, it might be helpful then to look at the portrait of the giants when they come up later in the biblical text. They don't just stop at this flood narrative. So there's actually, from what we've just looked at, it's really limited in the early literature in the Bible of how these guys are described as giants. Obviously, the Second Temple literature is very clear that they're giants, but the early biblical literature isn't. But later biblical literature definitely is clearer about how these Nephilim figures are definitely giants, especially when we come to the conquest narratives and also the ages in 1st and 2nd Samuel and Kings in the early Davidic monarchy, and the sort of the violent warrior clans and giants that the early inhabitants of Canaan, the Israelite inhabitants of Canaan, have to come up against. So these are just the passages. Numbers 13:33 talks about the Nephilim as being, that we were grasshoppers in their sight. We were really small. So big people. The Emim in Deuteronomy 2, they were a large people, tall, like the Anakites. Remember in Numbers 13, the Nephilim are the descendants of Anak. They were reckoned as Rephaim, as the Anakites were. The Moabites, however, called them Emim. So this Deuteronomy passage is just talking about the area they lived in and what the different dialects of the local people called them. But clearly, regardless of the different names, they're connected with giant figures, especially the Nephilim from Genesis 6. Deuteronomy 3 talks about a bit of a conquest section, especially against a figure called Og. And the towns of Og of Bashan they destroyed. Only Og, king of Bashan, was left from the remnant of the Rephaim. His bedstead, which is a bedstead of iron, is in Rabbah of the Ammonites. It's 9 cubits long and 4 cubits high. That's a big bed for a big guy. apparently. And I won't go into it here, but there is some literature that's been done that possibly suggests that this is a ritual bed, like they have actually found a bed of these measurements and dimensions in a Babylonian temple, and it was a ritual bed. I won't go into what the ritual was, but it was used to a ritual between a divine being and a woman, really reminiscent of Genesis 6. And so it's interesting that Og then is referenced as having a big bed, and sort of connects him with the Genesis 6 passage and the idea of how the Nephilim came to be in that passage. We turn to Joshua. Joshua is very explicit. They exterminate the Anakites. Remember, the Anakites are the descendants of the Nephilim in numbers. None of the Anakites were left. Some remained, however, in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. And obviously, the giants that remain in Gath become very famous because in 1 Samuel, there is a certain giant from Gath called Goliath, who is 6 cubits high. Very tall man, clearly a giant. And in fact, that he's connected with Gath, and in Joshua, they left some giants in Gath. So what are we looking at here? We're looking at people about this big, if you take the descriptions literally. Human, roughly about 5.5 to 6 foot average back then. Goliath is 10 feet tall. He's big. Og of Bashan is 12 feet tall. That's how big his bed is, at least if we take his bed as being his measurements as well. So even if the text itself isn't clear, which I think it is, but even if you wanted to make the argument that the text is not clear about these giants, their measurements make them giant. So if they're not called giants, they're certainly giant in how tall they are and how big they are. Interestingly, though, some people will go, well, we have no archaeological evidence of giants, so this can't be real. Maybe they're just giants in the fact that they're really violent, and giant is just a metaphor. But what's interesting is that we do have archaeological evidence, possibly of weapons and armor made for people this big. And this blew my mind when I read this archaeological journal, that in Israel, in a location called Kfar Monash, they found spearheads that were at least 66 centimeters long. To put into perspective, most ancient spearheads are 12 centimeters long. This is like 4 times bigger than that. They also found scale plates, like for scale armor, which were nearly 11 centimeters in diameter. As a comparison, most plate armor is only 6 centimeters in diameter. So these are big plates. This would make a big set of armor. Big weapons, big set of armor. This is from the article itself. So the spearheads bear signs of use, interestingly. So they weren't just ceremonial, they weren't just ornamental, they were used as weapons. Especially the heaviest one, which is bent on one spot and worn in several places. The spearheads would have required a longer, well-balanced shaft. The complete spearhead and shaft together would form a weapon measuring more than the height of a man. That is, the fact that they bear signs of use shows that someone had to be big enough to use them. And that's really interesting. You can make of that what you like. I like to think that this is pretty clear evidence for giants, like literal giants. But I'll leave you guys to decide that. The plates themselves, there's an illustration there again. There are about 800 of them. They're made of hammered copper and were found in packages containing 8 to 10 pieces each. They suggest scales of armor. It's a big, that many pieces, that big is a big sheet of armor, big suit of armor, big chest plate. Interestingly, this is what really interests me. The only parallel with these was found at Tel Gath, which of course is where Goliath comes from. So we have a biblical understanding that there were giants in Gath, and the only other place that they have found these sort of things is in Gath. Identical copper plates forming a package uncovered in the area of the city wall, and the finding of that is to the early Bronze Age. which is around the time of the Davidic monarchy, around the time of the conquest. So you can see these people are very careful. They're scientists, of course, so they're not going to come out and say, we found evidence of giants. But you can make some logical connections here that the armor they found, where they found it, and when it dates to, matches up very closely with the biblical narrative of giants in those areas. So this is why I personally would take these stories as referring to literal giants rather than it's a metaphorical word. And so because of that, when we look at Genesis 6 as well, we should be careful not to take it metaphorically, but possibly be inclined to take it literally. So with that in mind, we have giants. But what about some of their other names? You know, the Rephaim is an interesting one. How does that match with Nephilim? Also, once the giants are killed in the flood and also in the conquest, what happens to them? So this is where it gets interesting. And this is where it starts to sort of pull some threads together on how this relates to the portrait of spiritual evil, because obviously that's what we're concerned with here. So as well as the existence of physical giants, there are other passages that talk about evil beings that endure a continued existence in the underworld. They're often called the Motim or the Rephaim, like dead spirits or ghosts. But they're always connected with giants. They're always connected with warriors, like the Gibborim as well. So this is interesting. So Ezekiel 32 is a really clear passage. It talks about warriors that speak from Sheol. They've gone down and they've been slain by the sword. And then it talks about the enemies of Israel. So you've got Assyria, you've got Elam, you've got Meshech and Tubal. These are all nations that are in the underworld, and their rulers and their warriors are in the underworld. But interestingly, they're not the main focus of this. It's actually the beings that they're with that is the main focus. These do not lie with warriors fallen long ago, who went to Sheol with their weapons of war and placed their sword under their heads, their shields on their bones, for their terror was in the land of the living. So there's these national entities are different from these other entities, warriors who fell long ago. They went down with their weapons, and their terror is still in the land of the living. They're worse almost. So who are these entities? What is this talking about? So we can start by looking at how this is rendered in the Greek, because the Greek is a little bit more clear and makes some very interesting parallels with our descriptions of giants that we've been looking at. So I've got the Greek text there. I don't expect you to be able to read Greek, so I've translated it for you into English. But interestingly, that the warriors here is translated as giants. The giants will say to you, come to the depths. Are you mightier than us? Descend and sleep with us in the midst of those wounded by swords. They are laid with the giants who fell long ago, descended into Hades with weapons of war and placed their swords under their heads. Their lawless acts came upon their bones, and they terrified everyone in life. Slightly different interpretation here. But the interesting point is that these warriors are identified with the giants, and they are giants who fell long ago. What does that remind us of? It reminds us of Genesis 6, the Nephilim. They're called warriors there. They're also called giants, and obviously they fell long ago before the flood. So interesting here, they translate the Hebrew word Gibborim, warrior, as gigantes, giant. And they translate the Hebrew phrase Gibborim Nephilim, warriors who are fallen, or warrior giants, as just, again, gigantes, giants. All of this, Gibborim, Nephilim, it's all referring to giants, is what the Greek translation tells us. And that helps us to understand Genesis 6 a bit more, because in Genesis 6, they're both called Nephilim and Gibborim. So from this passage, we can make an argument that later interpretations viewed them as being one in the same, both being giants. They're also called Rephaim and Motim, dead spirits or ghosts. And Isaiah 26 says that they do not live and do not rise because you punished and destroyed them. You destroyed all memory of them. past tense, destroyed and punished. Psalm 88, do you work wonders for the dead, or do the departed spirits, the Rephaim, rise to praise you? Is your loyal love told in the grave, or your faithfulness in the underworld? Job 26, the spirits of the dead, the Rephaim, tremble below the waters. Sheol is naked before Yahweh, and there is no covering for Abaddon, the underworld. So these passages also reflect this idea of these entities, warrior entities, who fell long ago or were punished long ago. And interestingly, Job 26 makes a connection there with flood waters. They were destroyed by the waters, below the waters. Obviously, the underworld in the Old Testament understanding is below the waters. But it's interesting that they are also understood as being destroyed by these waters as well, which is very reminiscent of the flood. So what we have there is this really subtle hints that the giants, after they're destroyed, especially with context of the flood, but I think also in context of the conquest, they have this continued existence in the underworld. And this is actually an interpretation that's picked up on in the Second Temple literature and in early Christian literature. They're called illegitimate spirits in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They're called evil spirits or spirits of the giants in Jubilees. They're also called spirits of the earth in Enoch. We'll look at a couple of these because I think this will help us to understand how, again, ancient Jewish communities and early Christians understood these concepts and how they drew them together as one portrait. So first Enoch 15. This is talking about the judgment of the giants. It says the giants who were begotten by the spirits of flesh, they will call them evil spirits on the earth. The spirits have gone forth from their body of their flesh are evil spirits, for from humans they came into being, but also from the holy watchers was the origin of their creation. Evil spirits they will be on the earth, evil spirits they will be called. The spirits of heaven, heaven is their dwelling, but the spirits of earth, on earth is their dwelling. The spirits of the giants led astray, did violence, made desolate and attack and wrestle and hurl upon the earth, and cause illness. They eat nothing, but abstain from food, and are thirsty and smite. These spirits will rise up against the sons of men and against women, for they have come from them. From the day of the slaughter and destruction and the death of the giants, from the soul of whose flesh the spirits are proceeding, they are making desolate without incurring judgment. Thus they will make it desolate until the day of the consummation of the great judgment, when the great age will be consummated. It will be consummated all at once. What is going on here? What is the portrait here? Maybe we can read another passage. It might help. So this is in the book of Jubilees. Now Noah's sons came to their father Noah and told him about the demons who were misleading and blinding and killing his children. He prayed before the Lord his God and said, you know how your watchers, the father of these spirits, have enacted during my lifetime. The father of the demons are the watchers, are the sons of God. As for these spirits who remained alive, shut them up and hold them captive in the place of judgment. May they not cause destruction among your servants, for they are depraved and were created for the purpose of destroying. Then we read on that the ruler of these spirits, who is called Mastema here, but it's another word for Satan, asks God to leave some of them so that he can rule over them and exercise their authority over humanity. It says they're meant for the purpose of destroying and misleading, before my punishment for the evil of humankind is great. And then God lets him keep some of them. And we read that all the evil ones who were depraved, the archangels then imprisoned in the place of judgment, but a tenth were left to Satan, who exercised power over the earth. So there's a lot to unpack here. But what this is saying, especially in the Enoch passage, maybe we can start there, is that when the giants were destroyed in the flood, because they were born of both spiritual and physical entities, their physical bodies may be destroyed, but their spiritual entity still remains. And these spiritual entities are what those passages in the Old Testament prophetic literature was talking about. In Ezekiel, in Job, in Psalms, talks about spirits in the underworld who remain, and they cause destruction on the earth. The Second Temple literature is making the claim that these spirits are the offspring of the giants, the offspring of the Watchers. And so because they were half spirit, half man, you could kill their physical form, but not their spiritual form. The same is the case in the Jubilees passage, which talks about how the fathers of these spirits are the Watchers, are the angels. Therefore, that means that these spirits must be the giants, or at least the spirits of the giants. What's even further interesting is that these spirits are then put under the thraldom of Satan, who rules over the earth. If you remember in our passages looking at Genesis 3 and the serpent, he is given rulership over the earth. He's the ruler of this present age, is what Jesus calls him in the Gospels. And so what we have here then is a sort of a kingdom of evil spirits who are created as a byproduct of the destruction of the giants. This is George Nicholsberg. He is a Second Temple literature scholar, and this is how he breaks down this passage. I think it's really helpful to see what he says. He says, the giant's death is the prelude and presupposition for the continued violent and disastrous activity of their spirits, which go on unpunished until the final judgment. So the giants are punished in the flood, but they're not fully punished until the great judgment, where their spiritual form is finally to be judged. The consequences of the Watchers' sin, more than teaching humanity evil wisdom, is that the Watchers are heavenly and therefore immortal, and the divine spirit with which they are endowed, their sons, is ineradicable in the normal course of events. So the sin goes so far that it has tainted the actual form of these entities. They're not just men, they're spiritual half-breeds, and that is really against the created order, and that's a really big problem. The death of their human side serves only to free the spirit for further activity. Moreover, as one can see from their activities, the giants have inherited the wicked, rebellious side of their father's nature. It's similar there to what Deuteronomy says, where the sons shall inherit the sins of the father. This understanding is the case of the giants. The giants are just as bad, if not worse, as their fathers, and they inherit that from them. So he concludes that the freed spirits of the dead giants constitutes the demonic realm that carries on the activities for which the giants were judged and punished. The giants and the spirits that proceed from them are spoken of as the same entities. The Watchers' willful confusion of the created order has had its inevitable results. Because of their dual nature, the body of their flesh can die. On the other hand, their spirits have continued existence because they were begotten on earth, therefore they remain on earth. Here they constitute an empire of evil spirits who wreak all manner of havoc on the human race. And this is really interesting because it connects back with Genesis 3. Obviously, the serpent and the Satan figure is cast down to the earth. He has rulership over the earth. In the same way, these giants who are part man, part spirit, they are judged, but they are from their judgment bound to the earth. They cannot leave the earth, and they are set under the rulership of the ruler of the earth, who is this Satan figure. And so they constitute then the demons, Satan's demons. This is pretty much how Second Temple Jews and early Christians understood the origin of the demonic realm. This therefore means that the Genesis 6 passage firstly explains where the sinful state of man came from and why it happened, but then the later interpretations also color in the portrait of where demons come from. It's amazing. I think it's really informative. Do I think this is what the Bible is explicitly saying? I don't think we can make that claim. I don't think we can say for sure that that's what the biblical authors have in mind. But the fact that there are hints of this, especially in the prophetic literature, in the idea of the conquest narratives with the giants there, especially Ezekiel talking about the spirits of the giants sort of being rulers in the underworld. They have thrones. And then especially the Psalms that talk about the underworld being ruled by these spirits. I think that gives us enough reason to understand where this interpretation comes from and how this interpretation might help us understand the demonic realm today. So it's pretty cool, interesting. Might be a new perspective for some of you. It might not be. It might help to color in some of your already existing views. Later Christian literature, especially the Sibylline oracles, which we've been referencing a lot. The reason I reference it is because it's early Christian literature, so it helps us to understand how Christians were reading this literature. It talks about how this same fate, so the idea that upon them, it's not clear who them is in this passage, but in the context, I think it might be talking about either the giants or the watchers. There came a final ruin. They were cast from heaven and removed from life. The same way that the Ezekiel passages, the Psalms and Job, and then obviously the Enoch and Jubilees passages talk about them being punished by being killed. But then it says that Hades received them in the same way that, again, Ezekiel, Job, the Psalms talk about how these figures are in the underworld. And obviously the Second Temple literature in Enoch says that they are in the underworld. They went under the dread house of Tartarus, guarded by unbreakable bonds, to make retribution to Gehenna. So the underworld in hell. Wars and slaughter and battle cast them to the underworld. Remember, they are violent figures. That ends them up in death in the underworld. Others, the heavenly God himself, removed from the world in wrath. I am inclined to interpret that as him removing them from the world in his wrath of the flood, bringing them down to Tartarus beneath the foundations of the earth. And remember, that's the same understanding we had in these Psalms. They're in the underworld, under the foundations of the earth, under the waters. So I think in even early Christian literature, this is the same interpretation that we have. And this is also further connected with the idea of the Titans or the giants in Greek literature. This talks about the resurrection and the final judgment. The angel Uriel will break the bonds of Hades and throw open wide the gates and lead all these mournful forms to judgment, especially those of the ancient phantoms, Titans and giants who were destroyed by the flood. Very explicit connection there with the flood. And I just put a little note there. Interestingly, the idea of ancient phantoms is the same Hebrew with the idea of the Rephaim. Remember, we were looking at them as the shades. They are explicitly connected with the Titans and the giants. We have one instance where the Greek word Titan is used in Second Kingdoms or First Kings to refer to giants defeated by David. And so this further illustrates the connections that we've been making and therefore connects them also with the flood. Hope you guys are all good with that. Remember, this is really similar with Peter's words. Peter, remember, said that the angels who sinned were kept in Tartarus, chains and darkness, and handed over for judgment. And so it's very fitting that the later literature talks about the offspring of those angels and the sons of those angels are sharing a similar fate. I think that's really cool. What else can we say, though, about these giants and the spirits of the giants in connection with the New Testament understanding of demons? I think this might really serve to tie it all together. Clinton Whalen, who wrote a really fascinating journal article on the use of the giant language and the watcher language and Enoch language in the Gospels, he says that the giants, they are really closely connected with the idea of demons and unclean spirits, which I think helps to cement the New Testament, early Christian and Second Temple literature interpretations that we've just been reading. He says, while the giants themselves are nowhere explicitly called unclean, they are a product of sexual union which defiled the watchers and presumably their seed. So the sins of the angels, remember when we started this session, was understood as iniquity, impurity, unholiness. This is because in the Hebrew Bible's understanding of uncleanliness and unholiness, it's connected with the idea of blending of two things. So you shall not have a garment of two different cloths. Unclean animals are normally connected with animals that don't fit one criteria. Frogs are unclean because they are both land animals and sea animals. They connect the two. Animals that crawl but also fly might be unclean. Animals like pigs, which have, I believe, the fact that they are a herd animal but have a different foot to normal herd animals. These are reasons why people think they're called unclean. And so when you apply that logic to the giants, of course they'd be unclean because they're blending two things together, angels and women, heavenly and earthly. And that's really the reason why they're called unclean. And also the giants are a physical anomaly. They fit none of the established heavenly and earthly categories of being. So when the giants then are killed, would it be too much of a stretch to say that their spirits are unclean spirits? That's the logic here. It's a really interesting conclusion. We can see this further in the descriptions of unclean spirits in some of the Gospels. So you're all familiar with Legion and the Gerazim, the demoniac of the Gerasenes. Mark 5 says that when Jesus came across the sea to the region of the Gerasenes, he was getting out of the boat. Immediately from the tombs, a man with an unclean spirit went to meet him, who lived among the tombs. No one was able to bind him, not even with a chain, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains, and the chains had been torn from him, and the shackles had been shattered. No one was strong enough to subdue him, and during every night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was crying out and cutting himself with stones. When Jesus saw him, he ran and knelt down before him, and crying out with a loud voice, the man said, What have I to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I implore you, do not torment me. But Jesus was saying to him, Come out of the man, unclean spirit. And Jesus asked him, What is your name? And he said, My name is Legion, because we are many. And he was imploring him many times that he would not send them out of the region. Now a large herd of pigs was there at the hill feeding. They implored him, saying, Send us to the pigs that we may be able to enter them. He permitted them, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs, and the herd, 2,000, rushed headlong down the steep slope into the sea and were drowned in the sea. Any details that are reminiscent here of the giant story? I think so. I think there are some really clear interesting connections. Remember that the unclean spirits dwell in the underworld. Where does the man dwell? In the tombs, around the dead, with dead people, like the underworld. Also, it's interesting that Jesus cast Legion into a herd of pigs, because the herd of pigs themselves are unclean animals. Interestingly, the pigs dive headfirst into the lake and are drowned. What's the biblical portrait of what happened to the giants? Drowned in the flood. Interesting, hey? There's more details, though. So the man was dwelling in the caves. The giant spirits dwell in the caves under the earth, in the underworld. He was on the mountains. This is where the Watchers descended, on the mountains. He's chained, very much like the punishment of the Watchers. He also cuts himself with rocks, which is actually what happens as judgment to one of the angels, Azazel. He's buried under sharp rocks. Interesting, hey? Really interesting parallels here. So we have a demon, an unclean spirit, who dwells among the dead, who is chained, who asks not to be judged before the time of judgment, who is then cast into unclean animals, who then dive headfirst into a body of water and are drowned. This is where that scholar I mentioned, Clinton Whalen, in his journal article, wants to make the case that Mark here in his story has in mind the giants, the Watchers. This is why the unclean spirits are described in this way. And I think it's a really strong argument. I think it's really interesting to consider. Legion's request is really interesting. I implore you by God, do not torment me. Have you come to torment us before the time? Remember that in the Second Temple literature, the demons were allowed a time to be rulers of the earth until the time of the great judgment, where they will be consummated in judgment. The demons were aware of this. And interestingly, when Jesus comes, who is God, the demons ask him not to torment them before the judgment, because it's not their time yet. They still own the earth. They still rule over the earth. So who is Jesus that he should come and usurp them? Interestingly, Jesus obeys their request. He doesn't cast them into judgment. He casts them into pigs. I think this understanding really helps to understand what is going on here in Mark, but it also helps us to understand the later literary understanding of this idea of the giants, their spirits, the connection of the flood, and obviously the spread of demonic entities around the earth. But furthermore, I just want to maybe finish on this. The judgment of these spirits is also referenced in Scripture. This is Isaiah 26. It says that the dead will rise and the tombs will be raised. Those on earth will rejoice, but the land of the ungodly will fall. This is the Greek rendition, a little bit vague, but the original Hebrew is very clear. The dead will live, the corpses will rise, wake up and sing loudly, dwellers in the dust, as in humanity, remember, Genesis 3, they're the dwellers in the dust. But the land of the Rephaim shall fall. So you've got these two groups. The spirits of men will be raised to judgment and to life. But the land of the Rephaim, or the ungodly ones, they will fall. They are not raised. They are actually just cast straight into judgment. And that's the idea that we have of the spirits of the giants in the Second Temple literature, as well as literature in the New Testament. Think of the judgment of the devil and his angels in Revelation as the same sort of thing. So maybe we can finish off there. So just to summarize what we looked at today, we looked at how the flood passage of Genesis 6 describes how angels descend and they spread sin by having illicit unions with women. That causes all sorts of strife by blending two groups that shouldn't be, and it creates evil offspring that spread violence and wickedness throughout the world. These offspring, in their spread of violence and wickedness, constitute a realm of demonic entities that continue to spread evil and wickedness throughout the ages before the final judgment that will come. It explains also where the demons in the Gospels come from and why the demons are explained in the way that they are in the Gospels. The other element is the wicked knowledge that's given to humanity. And that was a theme that was carried through Genesis 3 and 4, but it sort of reaches ahead in Genesis 6 and is another reason why the flood happens, because humanity is fully wicked now. They are completely fallen because of their use of wisdom that enabled them to do sinful things like war, murder, adultery, idolatry, all things that are connected with the biblical understanding of sin. So from that, we can see this second portrait. This is where the idea of the complete fallen state of man comes and why the flood has to happen. But it's not the end of the story. Next session, we'll look at Genesis 10 to 11. We'll look at the idea of the tower and how even after the flood, these issues raised in Genesis 3 and Genesis 6 continue to come up, continue to present themselves, and continue to draw the world into a further fallen state. So I hope that was good. Thanks for listening. We'll see you guys in the next session.